Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, our topic is the trapping of pieces. Well, how would you trap a piece? The first things to look at would be if a certain piece has any places to move to in the following move. If it doesn't, oftentimes all you need to do is attack that very piece. Sometimes, of course, a piece may have a square or two to move to, and at the same time as you would attack the piece, you would also take away those remaining last two squares from the knight, or whatever piece it may be. Well, let's get started with our very first example in this lesson. Here we go. I've seen this position recently at a tournament that was a slightly different position, but very similar idea. It seems at first pretty hard to imagine that any of the black pieces could be trapped right here. Nevertheless, that's exactly the case here. Try to think and figure out what the move may be for white next. And the solution here is to immediately push the pawn forward. Here white is combining several tactical elements. The trapping is one, but just as importantly, the fork is also in the picture. Right now, if the rook would capture the pawn, of course, immediately the fork would arrive. But what happens if black does not capture the pawn? Well, that's when black has to start realizing that the knight doesn't have any good squares to go to. Unfortunately, for black's knight, the f8 square is taken by the king, and the only other square where the knight would not be captured at would be going to b8. So the knight was practically trapped, and now if the knight indeed returns to b8, all of a sudden the rook in the corner gets trapped. What a beautiful example. Let's move on to our next example. Here we are. This looks like also a very normal position with not much to fear for either side. However, in the exact situation that we're facing, black actually is about to lose the game, or at least a piece, right away. So it's very important at all times during a game to be aware of the forceful moves available in the position. Obviously a move like, let's say, rook c1, or in this case let's say rook e1, protecting the pawn on e4, those are normal moves, or protecting the pawn or trading on d5, those would be normal moves an average player would think of. It's true, pushing the pawn forward to e5 also comes into mind. However, we realize how good it is when we recognize that the black knight has hardly any square to go to. Just like in our first example, where the knight was pretty much trapped, that's exactly what's happening again. The black knight has only one square to go to, and that is at the edge of the board. As we know, a knight on the edge of the board usually gets in a lot of trouble, and in this case it's immediately getting into trouble because the pawn with g4 attacks it again, and at this point the knight has nowhere to go. So it's a very typical example, and that's a reason why it's important not to put your pieces in such situation where all it takes to attack it, and it's trapped. Let's move on to the following example. Here we are. In the position we see right now, black has a clear material advantage, still having the queen on the board. However, because it's white's turn, white can turn things around and the black queen gets trapped. As usual, I suggest you take some time and try to figure it out on your own before you listen further. And it's not very difficult how white simply forces the black queen into a completely trapped position. However, we can see already a red flag right now. The black queen at the moment only has 2 squares to go to, and that's f5 or g6. However, white with the correct follow-up, that is playing g4, can push the queen to one single option to g6, and now all white needs to do is to attack the black queen. And fortunately for white, it's ready to arrive with knight h4, and the queen has no place to go. Pretty impressive that in such a harmless looking position as we saw in the very beginning here, all of a sudden white is winning right away. Of course, it's very important to act right away and not to miss the opportunity, because if black would get a second chance to life, all of a sudden the black pawn could move up from f7 to say f6, and after that none of this would be trouble anymore, because then the queen could retreat towards e8. So white needs to act immediately, playing g4. Let's move on and look at a very typical scenario that we see in many games happening. It's very common that a bishop would move out somewhere early or in the middle of the game to g4 and pin a knight that's on f3 to a queen that's on d1. Very typical scenario. And it's also very usual that, in this case white, would attack at some point in the game that bishop with a little pawn push with h3, and that bishop would go back to h5. So this is a very typical pattern, and what I'm always suggesting to my students or listeners to remember from these lessons is the particular patterns, not an exact position or an exact move necessarily, but the pattern itself. So here we're dealing with something very common, that after an h3 attacking the bishop, bishop moves back to h5, and an f4 move could become a very serious threat and a very tricky move at that. So in this case black was careless and ignored what the threat is. As I said, always be aware of forceful moves coming, especially ones attacking your king or your other pieces. So in this case it was white's turn, and white is ready to trap the black bishop by simply attacking it first with the g pawn and then as a follow-up with the f pawn. And goodbye bishop, the bishop is trapped. Again, it's important to realize, similarly to the previous example, that if it would be black's turn, black would get the time and the opportunity to save his bishop and open a little road for the bishop going back by playing f6 or pushing the pawn up all the way to f5, and then the bishop can always retreat towards f7 or e8. So again, time is the essence by playing g4. And the next example is a simple looking rook endgame. 2 pawns each. That's all that's left on the board. In fact, black has just attacked white's pawn on c5. The immediate push of the pawn would backfire because black would get the opportunity to immediately put the rook behind the pawn from c5 with a check, fork the king and the pawn, and the pawn would be lost. So that's pretty much out of question. The white rook in the corner is unable to protect the c5 pawn, plus it's busy anyway guarding the other pawn on a3. So what's left is protecting the pawn with the king. Of course, white could protect it simply on c4 or d4, those are playable moves. However, either of them would miss the winning opportunity. In general, it's a good idea to combine defense with offense. Why? Because you're gaining time that way. You're not wasting time in just defending, but trying to accomplish your own goals at the same time. And that's exactly what white should do in this case. After the king moves to b4, it not only protects the pawn on c5, but also immediately attacks black rook on a5. And we can see that the black rook is almost trapped already, but it still has one more place to go to. The only place is to go to a6, and now that's it. The rook is stuck. King b5. One of those rare examples when the king becomes an attacking piece. However, it's not as rare in endgames as it would be, of course, in the opening or in the middle game. In endgame, it's quite oftentimes that actually the king becomes an active participant, not only in defense, but also in accomplishing attacking or offensive objectives, like in this case trapping the rook. In many other cases, very typical that the king would be the one running after enemy pawns, or stopping a pawn from becoming promoted to a queen. Let's move on to our next example. Here we are. At the moment, black is the one having the upper hand, having an exchange up. However, we can see that that black rook on g4 has no moves whatsoever. So what we see right now is that all white would need to do is attack the rook. However, the story is a bit trickier than that. Because, for example, if white would attack the rook with a pawn, then that pawn would no longer guard the g3 square, and the rook would get an escape square on g3. The same would be the problem if white's bishop would go to f5 trying to trap the rook, because then the bishop no longer protects the g2 square, and again the rook escapes and immediately attacks our own pawn. So neither of these attempts would quite work. So what should white do to still make the goal happen? Well, we have to attack the rook from the other side, and the point is that we are combining the trapping of the rook with actually creating a pin. What's happening is now the rook is attacked, it's pinned, therefore it cannot run away, the rook is lost. And after king f7, naturally we would not capture the rook right away, because in that case black would get our bishop in return for the rook. Of course, that would be material gain as well. However, there is no reason for white to give up his bishop for the rook when white can win it for free. The simplest way to accomplish that is to just push the pawn forward and attack the rook a second time, and as we said, the rook is in a pin, it cannot run away, and then on the following move we'll be ready to just capture that rook for free. Well, on one hand, of course, from the attacking perspective, it's very important to look out for enemy pieces that cannot move anywhere without being captured, or have only one or two squares, to try to take those one or two last remaining squares away from the given piece that can hardly move. However, it's just as important to remember from the perspective of the other side. Try not to put your pieces in a position where they are almost trapped, because from almost it's not unusual that actually reality happens and the piece gets trapped, as we are seeing it in all of these examples in this lesson. And let's go on to the next example. Here we are. In this endgame, black has the material upper hand at the moment, having two knights against a rook. The black knight at the moment on c6 is under attack. However, the white rook is unable to capture it right away because the white rook is hanging on a1. So the question is what to do, which piece to trap. It seems that all of the black pieces are reasonably positioned and none of them are about to be trapped. However, sometimes we need to create our own fortune, and that's exactly what white can do right now. As I mentioned earlier, in tactics we typically need to look for forceful moves. So that's of course a huge hint. Well, you may wonder, but during a real game there's nobody to tell me that when is the moment when I need to look for that combination. That's very true. And that's why that's much more difficult, of course, compared to a situation when you have me telling you, well, this is the moment, white to move and win, look for a forceful move. Or having a puzzle book or a combination book, but again, they specifically point it out to you that this is the critical moment. Well, I have good news that basically the whole purpose of exercising, solving these puzzles, getting familiar with these patterns, the whole purpose is to develop the pattern recognition, the sense of when to look for such opportunities. And for the experienced eye, it would be almost instantaneous to recognize such an opportunity. The more you practice, the faster you recognize those situations as well. I promise. In this case, all white needs to do is simply exchange the pair of rooks and then attack black's knight from the right place. We can already see that the knight from a7 has no place to go to. So all we need to do is attack the knight. However, not from a1, because then the white rook no longer guards the squares on the c file. Therefore, it's really important to go from the other direction, from c7, because now not only that the rook attacks the knight, but takes away the possible escape squares also from the knight. And of course, as the two knights are so far away from each other, they cannot protect each other. So therefore, black's knight is lost on a7 and soon after the game as well. Very nice. Let's move on to our next example that has again a different material distribution. Here we have queen and knight versus queen and bishop. And again it is white's turn, and white has the opportunity to trap a piece. However, just like in the last example, white needs to create his own fortune. There isn't yet a piece in the position where it could be trapped. Black's bishop on d7 looks absolutely greatly positioned and very far away from being trapped. It can go to a whole bunch of different squares. The black queen on h3 seems to have a decent positioning as well, attacking white's pawn on h2. However, here comes the trick. After white now trades the queens and forces black's bishop to capture back, all of a sudden the whole story changes. The black bishop is in white's territory. It can only move on one diagonal backwards towards c8. It cannot move anywhere on the other diagonal. So therefore, after white locks up that retreat on that diagonal, all of a sudden the black bishop has nowhere to escape. All white will need to do is move his king to attack the bishop, and then the bishop will be trapped. In such situation, the best attempt typically is to try to rescue the bishop immediately by trying to eliminate the pawn from g4. Well, it's a good attempt. However, the problem is white right now is not forced at all to capture on f5, which certainly would rescue black's bishop, but can simply follow up with his own plan, moving the king to g3, attacking the bishop. And now, very importantly, the white knight from d2 is guarding the f1 square, therefore the bishop has no safe squares to go to. And after pawn takes on g4, which protects, by the way, the black bishop on h3, white simply recaptures, and black is stuck still with the same problem, with the bishop on h3 being trapped. A very typical example, also very well worth remembering for some of your future games, so perhaps you will trap one of your opponent's bishop in a similar way. And let's see one more final example on the trapping of the pieces. Here we are. This is yet another example where we need to create our own fortune, and that is to create the trapping situation. At the moment, it seems that there is nothing to trap. Again, I suggest you take a little bit of time and try to figure out the solution yourself before you listen further. And here is the correct answer. What white needs to do, white again, starting with a forceful move, is best off exchanging the knights, and with that, all of a sudden, removing black's pawn from e6. And the reason why that's crucial, because the white pawn is intending to move forward with the protection of the rook from behind, of course, and trap black's bishop. In general, it's not a good idea to have your pieces positioned in a way when they have nowhere to go. Like we saw in this position, the bishop on d7 was in a pretty miserable position. Even if it doesn't get trapped right away, nevertheless, it's not a good idea to put your pieces in such positions where they are passive, where they have nowhere to go. But in this case, it's really important from white's perspective to act quickly before black opens up another diagonal for his bishop, and then there will be nothing to trap. And now finally, let's see the jewel of the week. Here we are. It's quite a funny looking position with the pawn structure that we see, and black has a rook, white has a bishop and 2 pawns as compensation, which is generally considered as a material balance. And white at the moment would be able to capture black's only pawn on f7. However, regardless with which pawn white would choose to do so, black would be able to capture also one of the white pawns on f5, and then the game would be likely to end in a draw. So, if that doesn't bring the desired result, what should white do? Another idea would be to try to deflect the black king by playing e7, and if takes, then play g7. The problem is, the black rook will simply move behind our pawn and prevent it from getting promoted, or at least promoting safely. I suggest you try to figure out the correct solution on your own before I show it to you. Let's try what happens if white advances the other pawn, with the idea that after king takes pawn, e7, rook e3, similarly as in the previous variation but from the other side. But now the difference is that white can try a tricky move in playing bishop e6, trying to disconnect between black's rook and the pawn that's about to get promoted. Fortunately for black, black can save the game here as well by an intermediate check and then swinging the rook over to a8. Now the rook is guarding the promotion square, and even after white plays bishop to d7 to help the pawn to promote, black comes just on time by playing king f6, inviting white's pawn to get promoted, and then capture, capture, and all of a sudden white lost the last hope to win, the last pawn on the board. So this is not the solution either. The solution is pretty impressive. White's best and winning move is to play f6. Now white is threatening to push either pawn e7 or g7 and then capture on f7 with a check and win. If right now the black rook captures this pawn, then already the rook is in an unfortunate positioning and white is ready to play g7 followed by king takes and e7. And look at that, what a powerful position the white bishop has, controlling the square where the black rook wanted to give a check and then go down to the 8th rank, controlling e6 where the rook could go behind the pawn, and controls the third option as well, the check on f1 from where it could go to e1 to get behind the pawn. But as we can see, none of those are possible without losing the rook, and therefore black's position is lost. How beautiful is this? However, let's see a few more possibilities after we go back all the way to the start. After white plays f6 in this position, what happens if black captures one pawn or the other. After fe6, white will simply push the pawn with a check. Of course, white must play forceful moves. And after king f7, sacrifice the bishop in order to then promote the pawn. That's nice, but what happens if after f6, black captures the other pawn? Well, then it's even simpler. Again we push the pawn, and the check comes now from the other side, and the pawn promotes. A beautiful endgame by the famous composer Procas. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this lesson and learned more about trapping pieces. Watch out, making sure your pieces don't get trapped. And of course, if you see one of your opponent's pieces hardly being able to move, look out for ways how to attack it. It may be trapping it. Thanks for listening, and be back next week for some more chess ideas. Bye-bye.